Most of the stories, tales, and legends of Spellslinger's younger days get a bit hazy during the period of the First Almarin and Elven War. This is mostly because historians were so focused on the events of the time. As Consul Gaylord Julian Cox pushed beyond Magistone, the Senate began to debate what should be done. He claimed he was merely solidifying their new borders by holding important crossroads and securing land for possible forts and new cities. But in order to assist in this, he raised 2 more legions. Even though he used his own money, any general, or consul for that matter, was supposed to secure Senate approval to raise more forces. Those who understand ancient Almarin politics would have known that the best idea would be to leave them alone after this happened. Legally speaking, the Senate had every right to demand Consul Gary return at the end of his term for a new election, disband his new legions, and return this new territory to Alsorien. A number of senators weren't even sure they wanted Magistone at all. They'd simply wanted the consul to crush the Alsorien army there. But this is not what happened. While the Almarin Senate debated if the wayward consul should be punished or simply recalled, Gary only had his supporters in the Senate put up light resistance to the ideas. It seemed like he was ready to return and face their judgment, and the Senate was pleased by this. However, the Alsorians had been busy gathering support from elven kingdoms the world over, and even formed a coalition of non-elven nations to oppose the Almarins, who many feared were growing too strong. The Almarins had never actually had to deal with international opinion before. In the past, they had gone from war to war against single entities or tribes that had no diplomatic connections with the greater world. So just as they prepared to recall Consul Gary and his legions, they received an ultimatum from this new coalition, demanding that they return all conquered territory, disband their legions, and turn over the consul to them to answer for supposed war crimes he had committed in his campaign. This was the start of the now infamous subtle messages of the Almarin government. The messenger was given a small scroll and sent back to the Alsorien capital with a message from the Senate and people of Almera. As the dignitaries of the coalition opened the letter sealed with the official Almarin stamp, they read the only 2 words written inside: "Eat shit." Much as the Archon had learned when she had asked Steve to clean his study on the day he was already cleaning it, Almarins hate being told to do something that they are already doing, or even about to do. So rather than continue with their plan to recall the consul and negotiate with the elves, they instead legitimized the consul's new legions, ordered more to be formed, formally claimed all conquered territory, and then made Consul Gary Grand Consul of the legions for the next 10 years. While there is no evidence in his journals to support the idea that the consul planned for this to happen, he certainly knew exactly how to capitalize upon it. After this incident, the rest of the world would also become far more familiar with the old Almarin motto: either it's our idea or fuck you. So it's easy to see why people were focused on other things at the time. But truthfully, there was more to it than that. Steve was blamed for the Almarin's sudden knowledge of some magic spells, and with the war growing ever larger, the Archon needed to be careful with how and where she used him. Plus, Steve didn't have the freedom to adventure around like he could before being blamed for a sudden large-scale conflict. So he spent most of the year helping prepare the academy for new incoming human students, as well as a series of experiments in his own lab provided to him by the Archdean, as per their deal for his employment. Then he was provided a second study after the first exploded. Then finally, a third study built further away from the academy and enhanced with some of the Archon's own magic to finally build an explosion-proof laboratory for him, which he then proved wasn't explosion-proof, but merely explosion-resistant. The Archdean wasn't done with Steve, however. She was merely biding her time, waiting for the right moment to use his services once more. When the time finally did come once again, it wasn't in any of the normal places one thinks to look for adventurers either. To be fair, it wasn't a particularly glamorous affair either, and bards prefer to save their songs for the big events. But it's still important to note this journey, as it would set the stage for even greater things to come in Spellslinger's future, and help explain some of the more misunderstood reasonings for one of Spellslinger's most well-known capers. This is about the very first time Spellslinger visits paradise. Must all of your experiments involve things exploding? the Archdean asked, as she looked around the scorched and blast-marked interior of Steve's new lab further up the mountain from Orbitus, where even his most disastrous failed experiments wouldn't endanger anyone else. They don't all involve it, really. It's just those are the ones that leave lasting impressions, Steve muttered as he waved his hands around. You know, when I approached the council about creating this place, I was worried they'd fight me on it, but they all agreed wholeheartedly. I think mostly so you'd be further away. Steve rolled his eyes as she mentioned the council. Then she picked up a bent and twisted pipe on one of his workbenches. So, you haven't figured out your mysterious future fighter's weapons yet? Steve sighed and slumped his shoulders before shaking his head. No, I can't figure out how they did it. They had these tubes that would explode and create smoke, but there was more to it than that. Like they somehow guided the explosion so that it would hit their enemies a distance away. All I can do is make more general explosions that don't really do anything but blow up in my face. Why not just use fire spells? She asked, but he shook his head. Because none of them were magic casters. If there's a way to use alchemy or natural ingredients to make something like that happen, it would be incredibly useful. I've tried mounting self-contained vials of minor exploding inside tubes with a little hammer thing that breaks the vial to try and use the tube to guide the blast. He motioned to a few more busted prototypes nearby as the Archdean looked over at them, her starry eyes glittering with just a hint of curiosity. And? She asked, before Steve just snorted and shrugged. And they exploded. It sort of guided the flame towards the end of the tube, but not in any really meaningful way. Plus, it wrecked the device in the process, so not helpful. He shrugged and scratched his chin then. Since he'd been cooped up in his lab, his neatly trimmed goatee had grown into more of a wild beard. I'm telling you, I've been combing through every alchemic recipe and text I can find regarding exploding or burning potions, and I'm stumped. It's unclear how far in the future these Almarins came from, so I wouldn't lose hope after a little less than a year of study, Stephen, the Archdean said as she set the broken tube back down. However, I was wondering if you've heard about the recent diplomatic incident regarding your people? Steve groaned and rubbed his face with his hands heavily. Don't remind me. Why did they have to provoke the Senate like that? As much as I like Gary, he did sort of overstep his authority, and the Senate was about to fix all of that. It's just... He shook his head once more and shrugged. I don't know if we can win this anymore. Didn't you say that about the siege of Magistone? She asked. Well, yeah, but now there's like a whole coalition of nations that might be bringing troops against them, and the rest of Alsorian is great for cavalry and horses, which we are bad at. Not to mention those Kasurian assholes are no doubt going to side with the elves, and they've got the largest navy in the world. And they've actually got ships that can sail across the Banded Ocean. Even if they can't make it through the storms around the Wild Islands, they'll just sail south along the Tusk coast, and then west to get to Alsorian. It's possible. He shook his head slowly as he thought about it. You say that like the Almarins don't have a navy. Didn't you defeat your greatest rival who used to have an impressive navy? She asked, and Steve shrugged. The Darjanins were across the shattered sea from Almera and had an impressive navy, yes. But all our ships are for crossing the shattered sea or coastal work. They're total crap in the open ocean. Besides, we cheated when we fought them. It wasn't really navy against navy, but more like navy against marines. What are marines? The Archon asked then as her cosmic brows furrowed. They're mostly criminals, killers, gladiators, or even gladiator rejects. Basically violent, angry people who lack the discipline for the legions but are too good at killing to let them go to waste. Then they're given the shittiest barracks and generally treated like shit by the other branches of our military. Steve explained, which just made the Archdean frown deeper. Why? Because that keeps them angry. He shrugged as if it should have been self-explanatory. Which is good because... Why? She asked, trying to get more from him. Because the angrier they are, the more willing they are to kill people? He once more shrugged as if that should be obvious. Look, in our wars with the Darginians, we realized that they had way better sailors and ships, so we had to build up a navy quick. But there was no way new ships and new sailors could beat them. So we cheated, and used a nail in a plank as a secret weapon. What? She asked, with a slight shake of her head, as if having trouble that this was the Almarin's secret weapon. Not just like a regular plank or a regular nail, I mean. He waved his hands as he explained. But a really big nail and a really big plank mounted at the front of the ship. Then our ships would ram the Darginian ships and slam the board and nail into their deck so they'd be stuck together. Then the Marines would rush across and kill the shit out of everyone aboard the Darginian ship. Then they'd hack apart the enemy deck to free the nail, raise their plank, and go do it again. So claims of our superior navy are greatly exaggerated. And like I said, we're crap on the open ocean. So what you're saying is that you could use some allies who understand sailing and the ocean in general? She asked, and Steve was quiet for a moment as he felt like he'd somehow been guided into a conversational trap, but couldn't really see where it was going. Yes, he finally offered, still feeling like the Archdean was about to trick him. Then you should be happy about this next task I'm giving you. She smirked then, as Steve sighed. Considering how you set me up for this, it's got to be something terrible, hasn't it? He crossed his arms and waited for the bad news, but the Archon merely shrugged. Not bad news. You'd have to do it anyway. I just wanted to make it clear that this will help your people out in the long run if you play it correctly. It sounded like a good thing, but Steve just narrowed his eyes, feeling even more suspicious now. There's some magic artifacts I'd like you to acquire from a set of tropical islands in the heart of a volcano. The vaults of King Kamehumana, he asked. No, the wild islands are too dangerous for most people even now. And even you. She pointed at him. Fair point. You know Duskmaw told me she was alive back then and partied with the king. Had a few of his artifacts around too. That's old. And powerful. Are you ever going to tell me what she is? He asked. Because I know she's not an elf and I don't think she's a dragon. If she were a dragon, why would she hide that fact? Many of our founding members were dragons. The Archdean mentioned, and Steve waved that off. Yeah, I know. But still, what's with the disguise anyway? As he asked that, the Archon shrugged. Many ancient creatures choose the forms of elves to walk around the smaller species. They are known for their beauty and grace, after all. She mentioned as Steve scoffed. Is that all it's about? Everyone wants to fuck elves? Like, I kinda get it, but they all seem so skinny and pale to me. I know I'm biased since I'm Almarin, but typically I like them a bit darker and with more meat on them. As he said and held his hands apart to emphasize his point as the Archon frowned. Sherry never gave me the impression of being fat, she mentioned, but Steve was already shaking his head. No, I didn't say fat. I said with more meat on them, compared to elves who are skinny, and I don't just mean around here. He waved his hands in front of his chest. I just mean more full in general, like Sherry is an adventurer, so she's got more tone and muscle. And her thighs. She's got real thighs, you know. He smirked a bit while nodding, but the Archdean just arched one of the galaxies that formed her eyebrows. Are you implying that most people have fake thighs? She asked, which made Steve fluster a bit. Not like fake thighs, but she's got like their thighs, you know? He asked, and moved his hands around as he spoke, but as he just looked up at the Archon's blank expression, he went on. You have no idea what I'm talking about, do you? She shook her head, and he just sighed and pinched the bridge of his nose. Whatever. Are we here to talk about my sexual preferences in women, or are you here to give me a mission? You're to go to the Insamulti Islands where the natives have been guided by either a local water spirit or an ocean god. I'm not exactly sure. What I am sure of is that they're guarding a set of both culturally and magically important artifacts that should help Almera out in many ways. If you retrieve these artifacts from the volcano with permission of the tribal chieftain, then they should promise their friendship to Almera and the artifacts themselves will be helpful in the oceans. She explained as Steve frowned. Not to knock any help we can get, but just what do you expect Almarins to learn from a bunch of island tribals? Look at the engineering marvels of Almera. Have these tribals got massive citadels or amphitheaters or aqueducts? He asked as he crossed his arms. No. She shook her head. But they did build ships that have crossed the desolate ocean. Have the Almarins ever done that? Steve glared at his boss for a moment before shaking his head. No, No, they have not, he admitted. Then go gather the rest of your team and go to the islands and perform their ceremony so you can get their permission to try and retrieve the artifacts. Do this diplomatically, and they'll be your friends for a long time to come. Be on your best behavior. She pointed an ethereal finger at him as he raised his hands as if to ward her off. I get it! I'll be my best, promise! But if I can ask, why help Almera? He frowned as thought it over, but she just smiled. With the war building up, Arbitus is growing more influential and wealthy by the day. Besides, after how things worked out at Magistone, I feel like we owe them. Just a bit. She shrugged, but he wagged a finger at her. You're using us as an excuse to raise the prices on nations that want students to study here, aren't you? He asked. Among other things, she admitted. Ever since you burnt down the Hellurian library, it wasn't my fault, he insisted. Ever since the library burnt down, she amended. I realized that to secure the future of Arbitus, I must take a more direct hand in shaping the world around us. This is part of that. Now get to work, and dress for warm weather. She reached out with a scroll in hand, and Steve sighed after a moment and reached out to take it, knowing he needed to secure help for Almera no matter what. This is so exciting! Fenrina clapped her hands as the assembled members of Doom were in Steve's study, waiting for him to prepare a portal to the islands. I've never been anywhere tropical! Just expect it to be hot and sticky, Steve muttered. Probably just a bunch of savages with bones through their noses standing around in grass huts. I have no idea what the Archon expects me to learn from these people. Not like they'll be any help to us in battle either. Most tropical savages I've heard of are all super scrawny, not enough meat in their diet. Probably total pacifists too. You sound so chipper and optimistic about this, Sherry mentioned with a smirk as Steve just muttered under his breath. Now, Steve, you've got to give them a chance. Maybe they'll surprise you. I just feel like I should be seeking out powerful allies, like real big nations or people with mighty fleets. These people aren't conquerors, they just sail around the ocean. He sighed then and shook his head. But you're right. I need to be more open. I give people trouble over not being open about me, so I need to just be open and accepting and whatever. He shrugged then. Well, Larry Love is all about meeting new tribals. I hear they love wearing nothing but skirts. And Larry Love is all about spreading dwarven diplomacy to new peoples. Oh, yeah, baby. Steve rolled his eyes as Larry slicked back his hair, even though he still had to put his helmet on, which would ruin the effect. Whatever, Steve said, clearly full of enthusiasm for this mission. Thankfully, the Almarin armor that had been provided for them at the siege of Magistone was perfect for warm weather like the tropics, so they were well equipped for the mission. Once Steve had the portal opened, they stepped through and all four of them were quiet as they took in the sights around them. The rich blue sky was dotted with a few fluffy white clouds. The island ahead of them was lush and green, and Steve just stared in wonder at the various brightly colored flowers mixed in with the bushes and palm trees that dotted the beach. Even when he looked down at the sand under his feet, it seemed lighter and softer than most sand. The ocean behind them lazily lapped at the shore and provided a gentle, cool breeze to offset the heat of the bright tropical sun above them. Okay, I take it back. This place is, pretty good. He nodded slowly as he looked around. This place is amazing, Fenrina gasped as she looked around. Look at the ocean, it's so blue, and those flowers, and this sand. As they watched, the werehusky began to run around the beach a bit as she couldn't help herself. She even ran down to the edge of the water and let the tip of a wave wash over her feet. But as she was about to go out further, a much larger wave crashed down ahead of her, and she hastily backed away. Fenrina, don't get your gear wet, Steve called out. Look, we'll come back and play in the water soon. Promise. The werehusky looked between him and the water twice. Promise? Promise, he insisted, and she huffed but did jog back towards them away from the edge of the water. Okay, well, I guess we need directions. He looked around and spotted a group of birds watching them from a distance. I hope those aren't geese. He muttered and eyed the birds with caution. They did look quite a bit like geese, though they had more interested striped feathers and streaks of black along their neck. Why? What's wrong with geese? Fenrina asked. Well, my people use them as guard animals. Nasty bastards, too, Steve explained. Well, guess I gotta try, honk honk tweet, whistle, chirp honk. After he made those noises in the direction of the birds, they jumped up and flew off. Well, I don't know if that's good or bad. You can speak to birds? Fenrina asked in surprise. Yeah, sure. I'm good with most languages. I've got a real ear for picking them up. Steve mentioned. If I can hang around people speaking another language for a while, I can pick up bits and pieces pretty easily. All except Berg, Ish, Burgich, whatever it is the Francomanians speak. The burger ones anyway. Or was it burger? He tapped his chin as he tried to remember. Why do you have trouble with the language? Fenrina asked. Because every time I try to listen in, they stop speaking it. Then they say they're being polite by switching to common. Yet when I try to insist, they just counter-insist and say that they'd rather practice their common. It's like some sort of conspiracy about not letting outsiders learn their crazy building block language. Did you know that they apparently just make up new words by jamming old words together? How is that a new word? Before Steve could continue his rant, they were interrupted by the call of birds flying around above them. And then they saw a number of tribals walk through the tree line and onto the beach proper. Oh, man, Sherry gasped out as they looked at the natives approaching them before she started slapping Steve's arm. Steve, are you seeing this? Yeah, I can see them. He acknowledged, but he was also fairly stunned by what he was seeing. His mental image of scrawny tribals with bones in their noses was very far off. The warriors that were approaching them were all quite large and impressive specimens. They were also decorated in a series of black tattoos that crisscrossed their bodies, and Steve couldn't be sure just from the look, but it did appear like the giant clubs they carried were fitted with shards of obsidian. But the largest among them was perhaps a full head above the others, and wearing a massive yellow and red cape and red and yellow loincloth that showed off his well-sculpted abs. They were all looking fairly imposing, but when Steve glanced over at Sherry, she didn't look worried. Instead, she was biting her lower lip. Hey! It was his turn to smack her arm to get her attention. They might be here to fight! Yeah, sure. But look at those thighs. I mean, yours are nice, but wow! That guy is... wow! And his abs! As she said that, Steve looked down at his own stomach even though it couldn't be seen through his armor. Yeah, well... He trailed off then as he saw the women who were following the men onto the beach. Look at those hips. How do you even get hips like that? I have no idea. All right, Steve, I'm invoking truce, Sherry mentioned, and he nodded as he reached over and shook her hand. Truce, he agreed. For a set time period or just until we leave the island? Until we leave the island, she nodded. Meanwhile, Larry Love was rubbing his hands together. And the goddess did deliver unto Larry the promised land of full-figured women with full hips and big... They're not even wearing shirts, Fenrina scoffed. I mean, it is hot, so I guess it's okay. But I can see what you mean about them being rather savage, Steve.